Welcome to Moonlit Insomniac. Tonight I'll take you on a slow journey through the Gardens of Persia, where water whispers, flowers breathe, and time itself begins to soften. This isn't just a story, it's a carefully paced experience designed to quiet your thoughts, slow your breathing, and give your mind a safe place to wander. As you follow along, you'll notice your body becoming heavier, your eyelids softer, and your thoughts beginning to dissolve, just like ripples fading on a pool of water. There's nothing you need to do but listen and let the gentle imagery guide you. Stay with me until the end, and you'll find yourself carried into the deep, restorative sleep your body has been longing for. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the sound of my voice and the slow unfolding of this story be your guide. Tonight, peace is waiting for you. Chapter 1. The Garden Gate. The afternoon sunlight softened into a golden haze, stretching long shadows across the earth. In the distance, beyond the hum of the city and the curve of the hills, there lay a walled garden, a place whispered about in poems and remembered in stories, where water whispered and trees sheltered secrets. Soraya walked in, her steps unhurried, her breath steady, as though she had entered not just a place, but a different measure of time. Soraya's name itself carried a melody. In Persian it meant, a jewel from the heavens. She had always been told that her name belonged in verses, the kind that old poets would inscribe on parchment by lamplight. And so, perhaps, it was fitting that her path had led her here, into a garden that seemed to breathe poetry itself. The gate before her was not grand or overwhelming. Instead, it was made of carved wood, softened by centuries of hands brushing against it, etched faintly with the geometric patterns so beloved in Persian craft. The motifs seemed endless, repeating yet never tiring the eye, reminders of infinity captured within earthly design. When Soraya pushed the gate open, the faint creak of the hinges mingled with another sound, the quiet music of water. It was a sound that had always calmed her, even when she was a child. The trickle of streams, the splash of fountains, the hushed chorus of water finding its way over stone. Persian gardens, she knew, were always built with water at their heart. In a land where deserts stretched far and rivers were lifelines, water was more than refreshment. It was a symbol of paradise, of order carved out of arid chaos. The very word for such gardens, pyridesa in Old Persian, meant walled enclosure, the root of the word paradise itself. Soraya paused at the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the shade. The garden spread before her in measured balance. Cypress trees rose like sentinels, their tall, slender forms reaching skyward, while pomegranate trees leaned lower, heavy with ripening fruit. Between them, roses spilled across trellises, their scent mingling with jasmine and the faint musk of earth still warm from the sun. The design was unmistakably Persian, the Chahaba, 4 gardens, divided by streams of water forming a cross that met at the center. From there, paths radiated outward, each lined with flowers, herbs, and fruit trees, each space perfectly balanced between nature's wildness and human order. Soraya let her gaze rest on the channel of water nearest to her. It caught the sunlight like strands of silk, rippling softly, carrying the reflection of sky and leaf. Such channels were not merely ornamental. They were engineered with astonishing precision, carrying water from distant qanats, underground aqueducts that had sustained Persian life for millennia. These quiet streams were, in truth, marvels of human ingenuity hidden beneath the earth, their presence revealed only here, in the garden's serenity. She began to walk, her sandals pressing lightly against the stone path. The air was cooler here, the trees forming a canopy that softened the day's heat. Birds darted from branch to branch, their calls bright and fleeting, as if they too delighted in the stillness of the place. At her side, Roses bloomed in shades of crimson and ivory, their petals opening in languid spirals. She recalled hearing once that Persian poets had written more lines about roses than perhaps any other flower. The rose, after all, was more than a blossom. It was a symbol of love, beauty, and even divine longing. And here, amid the hush of the afternoon, the roses seemed to whisper those verses again, though only softly, for those who lingered long enough to hear. Soraya slowed her pace. She had no need to hurry. The garden itself seemed to insist on slowness, on savoring each detail. She reached out, letting her fingertips brush lightly against the cool stone edging of the path. The stone had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Travelers, scholars, mystics, perhaps even kings, each leaving their presence behind, folded into the memory of the garden. As she walked deeper, she began to notice the subtle layering of scents. First came the sweetness of jasmine, almost honey-like in its richness. Beneath it was the sharper, citrusy note of orange blossoms from a grove farther on. And under it all lingered the earth itself, damp and grounding. Together they created a fragrance that was not overwhelming but steady, like an unseen embrace. In the heart of the garden she found a fountain. It was round, its basin carved from pale stone, the edges etched with floral patterns. Water spilled from a small spout at the center, rising only gently before falling again in ripples. The sound was soothing, unhurried, a murmur that could lull even the most restless thoughts. Soraya sat on the low edge of the fountain and closed her eyes. She breathed in deeply, feeling her chest expand with the mingled air of flowers and water. In the distance, she could hear the faint hum of bees visiting blossoms, their industriousness unbothered by her presence. She imagined for a moment the poets who had once sat in gardens like these. Perhaps Hafez, with his verses of longing and laughter, perhaps Sadi, whose wisdom still echoed across centuries. They too would have sat by fountains, breathing this same air, gazing at roses, listening to water. And their words had captured these moments, not to describe, but to awaken something deeper, the stillness of paradise found within. Her eyes drifted open again, drawn to the play of light across the water. The ripples shifted constantly, yet always returned to calm. She found herself mirrored in them. Her own thoughts had been restless when she entered, but here they slowed, softened, like petals unfolding in their own time. Soraya rose and began to wander again. The path curved gently, guiding her past fig trees whose broad leaves cast patterned shadows on the ground. She plucked one of the fruits that hung low, its skin soft, its color a dusky purple. When she bit into it, the sweetness filled her mouth, tender and honeyed, with seeds that crackled softly between her teeth. The fig, she remembered, was among the oldest of fruits cultivated by humans, cherished in Persia since ancient times. Beyond the figs stretched a grove of plane trees, their mottled bark pale against the green canopy. Their presence cooled the air even further, for Persian gardens were not merely places of beauty, but places of refuge. In summers where heat pressed heavily upon the land, gardens offered shade, fruit, and water, all the essentials of life, arranged with elegance. Soraya paused once more, her gaze drawn upward to the dappled light filtering through the leaves. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint rustle of branches and the scent of mint growing wild at the water's edge. Time seemed to unravel, each moment elongating, as though the afternoon could stretch on forever. And so she walked deeper still, guided not by destination, but by curiosity, by the simple delight of being present in a garden that had already endured centuries, and would endure centuries more. The afternoon stretched on, and the world beyond the walls faded. Here there was no urgency, no demand, only the slow rhythm of water, the steady pulse of nature, and the quiet presence of Soraya, walking, pausing, breathing, as if the garden itself were inviting her to rest within its timeless embrace. Chapter 2. The Orchard's Embrace. The sunlight softened further as Soraya wandered on, the warmth of the afternoon mellowing into a gentle glow. The garden seemed endless, yet never overwhelming, each turn of the path offering a new vista, a new quiet revelation. She felt no need to rush, for the garden itself seemed to whisper, "Time here is not measured in minutes, but in stillness." She followed the gentle curve of the path, past the fountain where ripples slowly calmed, toward a grove where the air carried another fragrance, one sharper, more invigorating. As she stepped beneath the trees, the scent revealed itself. Citrus. Orange blossoms swayed lightly in the breeze, their white petals gleaming against the green leaves. The flower's sweetness mingled with the faint tang of the fruit that was just beginning to swell on the branches. Citrus trees had long been treasured in Persian gardens. Soraya remembered hearing stories that they had been brought centuries ago from far-off lands, cultivated carefully until they thrived in Persian soil. To walk among them was to be embraced by freshness itself, the blossoms like tiny stars illuminating the branches. She paused beneath one tree, lifting her face to inhale deeply. The fragrance seemed to wash through her, cleansing her mind of stray thoughts, replacing them with a bright clarity. Even the faint hum of bees drifting from flower to flower carried a kind of rhythm that soothed her ears. Beyond the citrus grove, the garden unfolded again into balance. Water channels divided the space, each stream flowing with quiet certainty. Soraya's gaze lingered on their straight lines and intersections. The Chahabag design, 4 gardens bound by water, was not simply decoration. It represented the order of the universe itself, the 4 rivers of paradise, the meeting of heaven and earth, the harmony of creation. To step into such a garden was to step into a reflection of the cosmos, arranged in stone, leaf, and water. As she moved on, the air shifted once again. Now it carried the deep, rich perfume of roses. Roses had always been a queen among flowers in Persian culture, woven into poetry, music, and the very soul of beauty. Soraya slowed, her eyes falling on trellises heavy with blossoms, their crimson and ivory petals glowing in the light. She let her hand brush gently across a bloom, its petals as soft as silk. It was said that the rose was a teacher. Its beauty dazzled, yet it was brief. A reminder that all things bloom and fade, yet in their moment they are eternal. Perhaps that was why the poets had filled so many verses with roses. They reminded one to love deeply, to live presently, to savor beauty without clinging. A line of poetry drifted through her mind, one she had read long ago. The rose speaks of love silently in a language known only to the heart. She smiled faintly. The garden itself seemed to be speaking that language now, wordless yet eloquent. The path led her toward another shaded space, where the air grew cooler beneath broad plane trees. Their trunks were pale, patterned in mottled bark that peeled gently away, revealing new layers beneath. Beneath them the ground was carpeted with soft grass, and the faint sound of running water grew stronger. At the center of this grove, she discovered another fountain, larger than the first. Its basin was octagonal, carved from stone that bore delicate floral patterns along its edges. Water spilled steadily from 4 spouts, one on each side, feeding channels that radiated outward like veins of life. Soraya sat once more, resting against the fountain's edge. She closed her eyes and let the sound envelop her. For centuries, Persian gardens had been designed not only for beauty, but for the senses. To hear the water, to feel the coolness of shade, to breathe in the mingled scents of herbs and flowers. Even the placement of plants was intentional. Mint near the water for freshness, jasmine near walkways for fragrance, fruit trees for both shade and sustenance. Every detail was meant to awaken the body gently, and the spirit even more so. Soraya ran her fingers across the stone, tracing the patterns etched there. She wondered about the craftsmen who had carved them. Each line and petal had been shaped by hands long gone, yet their work still lived, still offered beauty to those who paused to see. That too was a kind of immortality, to create something that continued to breathe centuries after its maker was dust. After a while, she rose again and wandered toward the orchard. Here fig trees mingled with pomegranates, their branches heavy with fruit. The figs, with their dusky purple skins, seemed to glow in the dimming light. She remembered the sweetness of the one she had tasted earlier, and felt a quiet gratitude for its simple richness. The pomegranates hung like jewels, their skins a deep crimson, some beginning to crack slightly to reveal the glistening seeds within. The pomegranate was more than a fruit in Persia. It was a symbol of abundance, of fertility, of life itself contained in tiny seeds. Festivals had celebrated it, poetry had praised it, and families had gathered around bowls of its ruby jewels in the winter months, savoring the brightness of its taste. Soraya reached for one that had split open, its seeds gleaming like scattered rubies. She plucked a few and let them rest on her tongue. The flavor was sharp, tangy, alive, a sudden burst of vitality that contrasted with the garden's stillness. She smiled softly, thinking how perfectly balanced it was, the garden teaching her not only peace, but also vitality, not only rest, but renewal. The path beyond led her to a pavilion, its arches delicate, its columns slender. It stood slightly raised, overlooking a pool where water mirrored the sky. Soraya stepped inside and sat against the cool stone. From here, she could see the symmetry of the garden more clearly. The lines of water, the rows of trees, the flowers in their measured places. It was as though the garden itself was a prayer, a meditation in living form. She leaned back, her gaze lifting toward the sky. The late afternoon was beginning to tilt toward evening, and the first hints of gold touched the clouds. Birds wheeled lazily overhead, their wings catching the fading light. The air, too, was shifting, cooler now, carrying the faint promise of night. As she sat, her mind wandered to the poets again. Hafez, who had written of gardens as metaphors for the soul. Saadi, who had spoken of human unity in lines recited across centuries. Perhaps they had sat in pavilions like this, watching the same sky, hearing the same water. Their words had outlived them, just as the garden had outlived its builders. Together, words and gardens formed a bridge, from past to present, from one soul to another. Soraya breathed in deeply and let her thoughts soften. She imagined herself as part of the garden, her presence absorbed into its memory. Her steps had joined those of countless others who had walked here before her. And in that she felt a quiet belonging, not as a visitor, but as a thread woven into the garden's eternal tapestry. The sun lowered further, shadows stretching long across the paths. Soraya rose and walked once more, her steps light, her spirit calmer than when she had entered. She passed rows of lavender, their purple blossoms swaying gently, releasing a fragrance both soothing and grounding. She reached down to brush the stems lightly, and their scent lingered on her fingertips. Lavender, she knew, had long been used to calm the mind, to ease sleep, to quiet restlessness. Perhaps that was why it had been planted here, along the edges of the garden, to remind visitors to carry its stillness with them when they returned to the world beyond. At last she came to a small bench of carved stone, half hidden by climbing vines. She sat and gazed out at the garden, her eyes following the water channels until they met at the center. She thought of the word paradisa again, paradise. To step into such a place was to step into the reflection of paradise on earth. But paradise, she realized, was not only a place. It was a state of being, one the garden evoked gently but unmistakably. Soraya closed her eyes once more. Her breathing slowed. The hum of bees, the whisper of leaves, the murmur of water blended into a lullaby. Her body softened into the bench, her thoughts dissolving like ripples, fading into stillness. The afternoon deepened, carrying her with it into rest. And so the garden held her, not as a guest, but as one of its own, in the timeless embrace of water, earth, and sky. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Evening. The light of the afternoon stretched thinner now, spilling softly across the garden like strands of silk unraveling. Soraya lingered in her seat on the stone bench, her body sinking into stillness, as if the earth itself were holding her. The water channels that stretched out before her glimmered faintly, reflecting the changing sky. The sun was lowering, the day ripening toward evening, and the garden seemed to lean with it, drawing closer into itself. She rose again, her sandals whispering against the stone. Around her the lavender swayed in rhythm with the breeze, and the vines climbing the columns seemed to exhale with her breath. The sense of the garden had shifted subtly, for as the day cooled, different fragrances stirred awake. She caught once more the honeyed sweetness of jasmine, its blossoms faintly glowing in the fading light. The path before her curved gently, drawing her toward a shaded walkway lined with cypress trees. Tall and unwavering, they rose like pillars, their shapes sharp against the softening horizon. Cypress trees had always been present in Persian gardens, she recalled. They symbolized eternity, their roots anchored deep, their forms stretching unwaveringly skyward. Poets had written of them as guardians of time, standing witness to centuries of love, loss, and renewal. Soraya let her fingers trail against the bark of one as she passed. The texture was rough, grounding, a contrast to the silken petals of the roses she had touched earlier. She felt as though each part of the garden offered its own lesson. Roses spoke of beauty and impermanence, cypress trees of endurance, water of balance, and fruit trees of abundance. Together they told a story, not only of the garden itself, but of life in its many forms. As she walked deeper, the sound of another fountain reached her ears. Its cadence was different, a more insistent rhythm that echoed lightly against the walls of a nearby structure. She followed the sound until she came to a domed pavilion. Its ceiling was high, decorated with faded but still visible geometric designs. The patterns repeated infinitely, spiraling outward in star-like forms, a reminder of the Persian love for geometry as a language of the cosmos. She stepped inside and tilted her head upward. The dome carried her gaze toward the heavens, reminding her of the link between earth and sky. Such pavilions, she knew, had long served as places of rest, contemplation, and conversation. Scholars once gathered beneath them, reciting poetry, discussing philosophy, sipping tea infused with herbs plucked from the garden. Kings and queens had once sought shade in such spaces, their courtiers attending to them while musicians played soft strains of santur and ney. Soraya closed her eyes and, for a moment, imagined she could hear those faint echoes. The pluck of strings, the murmur of voices, the rhythm of words recited in languages that had graced this land for centuries. She could almost see them, figures gathered in the cool of the pavilion, their robes flowing, their faces alight with the glow of lanterns as twilight deepened. Stepping back out, she found herself drawn toward the orchard once again. The figs and pomegranates seemed to shimmer more vividly in the waning light. She thought of the ancient Persian feasts, where such fruits had been served not only for nourishment, but as symbols of prosperity and blessing. In particular, the pomegranate, a fruit of myth as well as meal, was often present at weddings, at seasonal celebrations, its seeds representing the endless renewal of life. The garden's paths guided her gently onward until she reached a wide pool. Its surface mirrored the sky, which was now tinged with rose and amber. A single breeze stirred, scattering ripples across the reflection. Soraya paused to watch, her eyes softening as the water shifted from stillness to motion and back again. It reminded her of the lines of poetry she had once read. The world is but a reflection, ever changing, yet the truth beneath it never stirs. As she lingered by the pool, her body loosened into the rhythm of the evening. Even her heartbeat seemed to slow, syncing with the softened murmur of the garden. She sat by the edge, dipping her fingers lightly into the water. The coolness traveled through her skin, grounding her further into the moment. Twilight deepened. The colors of the sky shifted into lavender, then indigo, and the garden began to transform. Lanterns, once unnoticed, glimmered faintly along the walkways. Their soft light, golden and trembling, mingled with the last breath of day. The effect was not sudden but gradual, as though the garden itself exhaled light to welcome the night. Soraya walked slowly, following the lanterns that guided her back toward another pavilion. Here the air carried the scent of mint and lemon balm, herbs cultivated for refreshment. She remembered that Persian gardens had always been designed with the human body in mind, to soothe the senses, to balance the spirit, to provide not only shade and beauty, but health itself. The herbs at her feet were not merely ornamental. They had long been brewed into teas, crushed into remedies, their fragrances chosen with intention. She stepped into the pavilion and sat, her gaze drawn upward once more. Through its arches she could see the first stars appearing, delicate points of light scattered across the sky. Stars had always fascinated her, not only for their beauty, but for their constancy. They had guided travelers across deserts, sailors across seas, and dreamers across the landscapes of their own thoughts. As she watched, she recalled how ancient Persians had studied the stars deeply. They had mapped constellations, measured time, aligned their gardens and buildings with celestial paths. To sit here now, in a garden that mirrored paradise, was also to sit in harmony with the greater cosmos. The evening deepened, and the garden shifted into another rhythm. Crickets began their steady chorus, the sound blending with the steady flow of water. The fragrance of night-blooming jasmine grew stronger, almost intoxicating in its sweetness. Soraya closed her eyes again, letting the symphony of scent and sound wash through her. She thought of Hafez again, the poet who had written that a garden at twilight was not merely a place of rest, but a mirror of the soul. His words, centuries old, seemed alive here, their meanings unfolding with each passing moment. Soraya leaned back against the cool stone of the pavilion. She felt herself dissolve slowly into the embrace of the night. The garden, with all its layers of meaning, history, poetry, fragrance, light, had absorbed her fully. She was no longer separate from it, but part of its story, one more presence woven into its timeless pattern. The hum of bees had faded, replaced by the soft flutter of moths drawn toward lantern glow. The roses, now shadows, still seemed to exhale their perfume. The cypress trees, dark against the sky, stood unwavering, like sentinels guarding the silence. Her breath slowed, her body softened, and her thoughts dissolved further. She felt as if she were drifting between worlds, one rooted in the earth beneath her, the other lifted toward the stars above. And in this space, this gentle threshold, Soraya found not only peace, but a kind of homecoming. The garden had welcomed her not as a guest, but as kin. And the night, unfolding gently, seemed to whisper its promise. Rest now. You belong to this stillness as much as it belongs to you. Chapter 4. The Language of Stars. The hush of twilight deepened into night, and Soraya remained seated within the embrace of the pavilion. Around her the lanterns flickered more brightly now, their glow mirrored in the dark glass of the water channels. Each flame trembled in rhythm with the breeze, as though the night itself were breathing through them. Above, the sky unveiled itself fully. One by one, stars emerged, scattering across the heavens like spilled jewels. Soraya tilted her head upward, her breath slowing as she gazed into the infinite expanse. The constellations stretched across the velvet canopy, patterns she recognized only faintly, but which had been studied and revered here for centuries. The Persians, she recalled, had been stargazers long before telescopes captured the skies. Ancient astronomers had built observatories like the famed one in Maragay in the 13th century, aligning their instruments with the heavens. They had charted the movements of planets and the rising of stars, not only to measure time, but to understand harmony itself, how the rhythms of the cosmos reflected the rhythms of life on Earth. The thought soothed her. The stars had guided shepherds across deserts, caravans along the Silk Road, and sailors across waters shimmering in moonlight. And now, here they were again, steady and luminous, guiding her heart into quiet. A moth fluttered past her face, drawn toward the lanterns that glowed softly nearby. Its delicate wings caught the light for an instant before it vanished into the dark. Soraya smiled faintly. The garden seemed alive with small movements, each creature adding its thread to the larger tapestry of night. The crickets sang, the water murmured, the roses released their fragrance more deeply as the air cooled. She rose from the pavilion and began to walk slowly, her steps light upon the stone. The path led her once again toward the water, where reflections shimmered with starlight. Each ripple carried a fragment of the sky, as though the heavens themselves had descended to rest upon the earth. The word Paradisa, paradise, returned to her mind. In these moments, she felt she understood it more deeply. To walk in a Persian garden at night was not merely to wander among trees and flowers. It was to step into a mirror of the universe, where water and stone, earth and sky, fragrance and silence were woven into harmony. As she walked, Soraya thought of the poets who had once gazed at these same stars. Hafez had compared them to the eyes of the beloved, scattered across the night. Rumi had seen them as sparks of divine longing, reminding souls of the home they carried within. Saadi had spoken of the shared humanity beneath the same sky. Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. The verse lingered in her heart as she walked. The stars above her were the same stars that had shone upon those poets, upon kings and wanderers, upon lovers who had once whispered to one another in gardens like this. Time dissolved in that realization, leaving only presence, the steady rhythm of water, the cool breath of night, and the endless sky. Soraya reached another corner of the garden, where a marble platform extended over the water. She stepped onto it, her sandals brushing lightly against its surface. The view here opened wider, revealing long rows of cypress trees reflected in the pool, their dark shapes stretching infinitely in both directions. The scene reminded her of ancient miniature paintings she had seen, those delicate artworks in which gardens were depicted as perfect symmetries, bordered by gold leaf, each tree and flower carefully rendered. She sat cross-legged upon the marble, her gaze drifting between the stars above and their counterparts shimmering in the water below. The stillness wrapped around her, soothing her body, softening the edges of her mind. For centuries she knew these gardens had been sanctuaries, places where rulers escaped the burdens of their courts, where mystics retreated for contemplation, where travelers found rest. The very design of the Chaharbagh was said to be inspired by the gardens of ancient Persia, described in the Avesta, sacred texts of Zoroastrianism. In those visions, paradise was a place of flowing waters, fruit-laden trees, and eternal harmony. To create such a space on earth was to reflect divine order within human reach. The thought settled over her like a gentle cloak. She felt herself dissolve once again, not in sleep, but in a deeper kind of stillness, the kind that hovers between waking and dreaming. From nearby, she heard the faint sound of movement. She turned her head and saw an attendant lighting another row of lanterns. His presence did not disturb her. Instead, it added to the scene. He moved slowly, reverently, as though aware that his task was not merely to light flame, but to keep the night itself alive. Each lantern he touched bloomed into glow, sending warm circles of light across the path. Soraya watched, her heart softening at the quiet dignity of it. She thought of how, centuries ago, such attendants would tend the gardens at night, ensuring that water flowed, lanterns burned, and flowers were cared for. A Persian garden was not a thing to be admired only in daylight. It was a living sanctuary, tended continuously, so that its harmony would never be broken. When the attendant disappeared into the shadows, Soraya rose again and continued her walk. The air grew cooler still, brushing against her skin with a gentleness that carried both freshness and calm. She wrapped her scarf a little closer around her shoulders and let her pace slow. Each step seemed to fall in rhythm with the garden's heartbeat, steady, patient, eternal. At last she reached another pavilion, this one smaller and more intimate. Its columns were slender, its arches delicate. Inside, a small carpet had been laid upon the floor, and on it rested a brass tray with an old teapot and 2 cups. Soraya knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She could almost imagine someone had just been here, sipping tea as the night unfolded. Tea had become inseparable from Persian culture centuries ago, though it had first arrived from faraway lands. In time, it had taken root so deeply that no gathering felt complete without it. Here in the garden, tea was more than refreshment. It was a ritual of presence. The steam rising from its surface carried the scent of herbs, mingling with jasmine and mint, deepening the stillness of the night. Soraya lifted the empty teacup and held it between her palms. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, imagining the warmth, the taste, the shared conversations that would have once filled this space. For a moment, she felt as though those echoes returned. The laughter of friends, the wisdom of poets, the quiet murmur of companions speaking beneath the stars. She set the cup down gently and leaned back, letting her gaze drift again toward the sky. The stars seemed brighter now, their patterns clearer. She traced them silently with her eyes, though she could not name them all. Somewhere among them, she knew, lay stories told by Persians long before her, of kings and heroes, of mythical birds and eternal fires. Her body softened further, her breath deepening into calm. She felt as though she could stay here forever, resting in the embrace of the garden, listening to its whispers, its poetry, its silence. And perhaps, she thought, that was the garden's gift. Not only to offer beauty, but to remind the soul of its own belonging. To sit here was to remember that one was already whole, already woven into the fabric of the cosmos, already at peace. Soraya closed her eyes, the murmur of water and the chorus of crickets folding around her. Her body sank into stillness, her thoughts dissolving like starlight into night. And above her the stars kept watch, silent, eternal, and endlessly patient. Chapter 5. Echoes of Music. The night had deepened, soft and velvety, wrapping the garden in its embrace. Soraya sat quietly beneath the pavilion, her eyes half closed, her breath slow and steady. The air was cool now, touched with the faint dew that whispered across the leaves. Around her, lanterns glowed like small suns, their light spilling gently over stone and water, their reflections trembling across the channels. For a while there was only silence, or rather the kind of silence that lives within layers of sound, the murmur of water, the soft chorus of crickets, the rustle of leaves as the night air moved through the trees. Soraya let these sounds fold around her like a blanket. Her body loosened further, her thoughts dissolving until only presence remained. And then, faintly, she heard it. It was not loud, not even insistent. It was the faint plucking of strings, a sound so delicate she first thought it was a memory. But as she listened, it grew clearer. The silver tones of a santur, that ancient Persian instrument whose hammered strings could shimmer like moonlight itself. The notes rose and fell gently, each one lingering, then fading into the air like the drift of incense. She turned her head, though she saw no one. Perhaps the sound was carried on the night air from another corner of the garden. Or perhaps, she thought, it was simply the garden remembering itself. For music had always belonged here. Persian gardens, she knew, had not been silent places. They had been stages for poetry, music, and conversation. In the courts of kings, musicians had once played beneath the stars, their instruments weaving melodies that matched the rhythm of water and the glow of lanterns. Even travelers resting here had brought their songs, filling the air with verses that echoed across centuries. Soraya closed her eyes again, surrendering to the music. The santur was joined, in her imagination if not in reality, by the breath of a ney flute. Its sound was different, hollow, longing, like the call of the soul itself. The two instruments wove together, creating a tapestry of sound that drifted gently across her heart. She remembered a verse she had once read from Rumi. "We are the flute, our music is all yours. The sound of being is from your breath, O beloved." The words seemed to rise within her as naturally as the music itself. The garden was not merely a place of rest. It was a reminder, a reflection of the greater harmony to which all things belonged. Her breathing slowed still further. She let each note rise and fall with her inhale and exhale until she felt herself dissolve into the rhythm. Time slipped away. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. She could not tell. The music, whether real or imagined, carried her deeper into stillness. When at last she opened her eyes again, the stars above seemed brighter, the sky more infinite. The cypress trees, tall and unwavering, looked almost like guardians standing in reverence to the heavens. The water mirrored it all, doubling the cosmos beneath her feet. She rose slowly and began to walk once more, her steps measured, her sandals whispering against the path. The garden at night was transformed, each detail softened by shadow and glow. Roses glimmered faintly, their petals catching lantern light. The pomegranates in the orchard gleamed like clusters of hidden embers. Even the air seemed richer, thick with fragrance and silence. As she wandered, Soraya thought again of how gardens had always been mirrors of paradise. In Zoroastrian vision, paradise was a place of eternal spring, where rivers flowed endlessly, and every tree bore fruit. In Islamic tradition, too, paradise was described as gardens beneath which rivers flowed, a place of balance, shade, fragrance, and eternal life. To walk here was to touch those visions, to taste a reflection of eternity in the present. Her steps carried her toward another fountain, this one smaller, tucked into a corner where jasmine vines climbed the walls. The fountain's trickle was softer, more private, like a whisper meant only for those who lingered. She sat upon its edge and ran her fingertips through the water, watching ripples shift the reflections of lanterns. It was then she remembered another tradition of Persian nights, storytelling. Families and friends would gather in gardens, sipping tea, breaking open pomegranates, sharing walnuts and dried figs while someone recited poetry or spun tales of ancient heroes. Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, would come alive in such settings. The battles of Rostam, the wisdom of Zal, the tragic beauty of Sohrab. These stories were not merely entertainment, they were memory itself, woven into words, carried forward like torches across time. Soraya smiled faintly, imagining such a gathering here. Perhaps, centuries ago, on this very stone, someone had leaned forward by lantern glow, reciting verses that stirred hearts awake. Perhaps listeners had leaned in close, their eyes wide, their souls carried into the worlds of myth and meaning. The thought comforted her. She too was part of that continuum now, another presence within the garden's long memory. Her quiet steps, her slow breaths, her silent listening were all threads added to its tapestry. The night grew cooler, and a light breeze carried with it the scent of roses. Soraya wrapped her scarf a little more closely around her shoulders. She tilted her face upward once more, letting the starlight bathe her skin. It was as though the heavens themselves reached down, folding her into their embrace. She thought again of the word belonging. The garden seemed to whisper it at every turn. Belonging in the stillness, belonging in the rhythm of water, belonging beneath the stars that had watched humanity since its dawn, belonging to the earth and to the sky at once. Her body softened further, her thoughts dissolving until only presence remained. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was not simply in the garden, but of it, as though her breath were one with the breeze, her pulse one with the water, her soul one with the stars. The music, faint and distant, drifted once again through her mind. Whether memory, imagination, or reality, it did not matter. It was enough to remind her that harmony is always present, waiting to be heard, waiting to be felt. And so she sat, quiet and still, her heart folded into the night. The lanterns flickered, the water whispered. The stars kept their patient watch. And Soraya, within it all, rested in the eternal garden of silence. Chapter 6. Whispers of the Midnight Garden. The night deepened into stillness, and Soraya felt time dissolve. The garden seemed endless, yet not in distance, endless in its patience, endless in its silence, endless in its embrace. The lanterns glowed softly along the pathways, their golden halos trembling against the cool stone. Above, the sky had opened into its full majesty, thousands of stars scattering across the dark expanse, each one steady, each one eternal. Soraya drew her scarf a little closer around her shoulders, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She walked slowly without destination, for the garden itself was the journey. Each step upon the stone carried her deeper into its heart, and deeper, too, into her own quietness. Her thoughts wandered gently to those who had once walked such gardens centuries before. Kings had strolled here, their courtiers at their side. Scholars had debated philosophy beneath the arches of pavilions. Scribes had composed verses by lantern light. Lovers had exchanged glances amid the roses. Every path carried the imprint of those presences, now dissolved into memory, but still alive in the stones, in the water, in the air. She paused by a channel of water, watching its surface shimmer with stars. The Persians had long seen water as sacred, a living element, a reflection of purity and divine order. The ancient qanats, those underground aqueducts that had carried water for miles, had been feats of ingenuity and devotion. Without them, no garden could exist, and so each drop of water that flowed here was a gift of engineering and reverence, a miracle disguised as a whisper. Soraya knelt and let her hand skim across the water's surface. It was cool, alive, carrying the reflections of the cosmos. In that moment she felt as though she was touching both the earth and the sky, her fingers dissolving into their unity. From somewhere deep within the garden she thought she heard another sound, faint, rhythmic, like the steady pulse of a drum. She stilled herself, listening. The sound was low, almost hidden, yet persistent. It reminded her of the frame drums used in Sufi gatherings, their beats echoing the rhythm of the heart. She closed her eyes and imagined such a gathering here, centuries ago. Beneath the stars, mystics in flowing robes might have gathered in a circle, the sound of the drum carrying them into rhythm. Their voices might have lifted in chant, repeating the names of the divine, their bodies swaying gently, their hearts opening wider with each beat. The garden would have held them, just as it now held her. In her mind's eye, she saw them moving, not in haste, but in slow, reverent circles. Some might have spun in the whirling dance of devotion, their robes unfolding like blossoms, their faces serene as the night embraced them. To the Sufis, music was not mere art. It was a ladder to the heavens, a bridge between human longing and divine presence. The thought filled her with a quiet warmth. Though the gathering was only imagined, the rhythm of the drum seemed to pulse still within her. She placed her hand lightly against her chest, feeling the slow beat of her own heart, steady and patient, like the garden itself. She rose again and continued her walk, her steps carrying her toward another corner where an ancient plane tree spread its branches wide. Its trunk was massive, its bark patterned with centuries of growth, its roots stretching deep into the soil. She paused beneath it, placing her hand against its trunk. The texture was rough, grounding, like the cypress she had touched earlier, yet different, older, wiser, as though it had gathered centuries of silence within its rings. Trees in Persian gardens were never chosen by chance. Each carried meaning, the cypress for eternity, the pomegranate for abundance, the fig for sweetness, the orange for freshness, the plane tree for shade and shelter. Together they formed a living language, a vocabulary of symbols planted into earth, speaking to those who lingered long enough to listen. Soraya leaned against the trunk and tilted her gaze upward. The branches arched above her like a canopy, leaves trembling faintly against the starlight. She felt the tree's stillness seep into her, anchoring her body, quieting her mind. And then she remembered how ancient Persians had also been astronomers, measuring the heavens with precision. She thought of the great observatory of Ulugh Beg in Samarkand, though far from here, still a testament to the Persian tradition of stargazing. Astronomers had charted constellations, measured planetary movements, and named the stars that now glittered above her. To look at the night sky in this garden was to see not only beauty but knowledge, devotion, and wonder carried across millennia. She whispered softly into the night, repeating a name of one of the constellations she recalled, Parvin, the Pleiades. Its cluster shimmered faintly, delicate as scattered jewels, reminding her of verses she had once read. Parvin at night is a necklace for the sky, each star a pearl strung by unseen hands. The image filled her heart with ease. The stars, the trees, the water, the fragrance of jasmine and roses, all of it spoke of unity, of connection, of the unseen order that held everything together. She moved on, her sandals brushing lightly against the path, until she came once more to the central fountain. It glimmered in the lantern light, its waters rising gently, then falling into ripples. She sat upon its edge, leaning slightly forward, her reflection mingling with that of the stars above. For a long moment she simply watched, her body swaying almost imperceptibly with the rhythm of the water. She thought of how gardens had been used for rest, for pleasure, but also for philosophy. Scholars once walked slowly through such paths, using the balance of water and stone as metaphors for balance within the self. They spoke of justice mirrored in symmetry, of wisdom mirrored in stillness, of love mirrored in fragrance. To walk in a garden was to walk in a living lesson, where the mind could rest and the spirit could awaken. Soraya touched the water once more, feeling its coolness steady her pulse. She breathed in deeply, filling her chest with the mingled fragrance of night-blooming jasmine, roses, and the faint sharpness of mint. Each breath felt like a gift, reminding her of the Persian belief that paradise was not far away but present here, mirrored in the world of form. Her eyelids grew heavier, her body softening further into rest. She closed her eyes, listening once more to the faint rhythms of the garden. The imagined music of the santur and ney lingered, weaving through the pulse of the drum, through the murmur of water, through the chorus of crickets. She felt as though she was no longer merely walking in the garden, but becoming part of its fabric. Her breath was its breeze. Her heartbeat was its drum. Her silence was its silence. The night stretched on, and still the stars watched, and Soraya, resting within the midnight garden, drifted deeper into stillness, one more presence folded into its eternal embrace. Chapter 7. The Midnight Watch. The night had reached its deepest quiet. Soraya sat still by the fountain, her reflection mingling with stars that seemed closer now, as though the heavens themselves had descended to meet the earth. Around her, the lanterns flickered in steady rhythm, their glow softened by the gentle breeze that rustled through the cypress trees. She could feel the garden breathing, not in the way lungs breathe, but in the way silence expands and contracts. The water pulsed, the crickets sang, the leaves shivered, and then all grew still again, as if the world itself was taking a deep, patient breath. Soraya rose slowly, her steps unhurried, her sandals whispering along the stone path. She felt no need to hurry. Midnight was not a time for urgency. It was a time for surrender, for slipping into the rhythm of the unseen, for listening to what could not be heard in the noise of day. As she walked, she thought of the many who had kept watch at night in gardens like these. In ancient Persia, the garden had not only been a place of beauty, but of vigilance. Attendants would tend the lanterns, water the plants, watch over the flowing channels, ensuring that the harmony of the garden never broke. To walk here at midnight was to join those watchmen in their quiet guardianship. She came to a long colonnade, its arches half in shadow, half in lantern light. She paused at the threshold, resting her hand against one of the stone columns. The patterns carved into it spiraled upward, repeating geometric designs that mirrored the stars above. Persians had always favored geometry in their art and architecture, seeing in it a reflection of divine order, the way infinity could be glimpsed through repetition, the way the cosmos could be captured in simple lines. Soraya stepped into the colonnade, her sandals clicking softly against the cool stone floor. The arches framed the garden beyond, each one like a window into another painting. She walked slowly, savoring each frame, each view of cypress trees, lanterns, roses, and water. At the far end of the colonnade, she came to a raised platform where another small pavilion stood. Its dome gleamed faintly in the starlight, patterned with faded mosaics that had once been vibrant. She stepped inside and looked upward. Even in its faded state, the dome carried majesty. Its designs spiraled outward like galaxies, reminding her again of the Persian devotion to the stars. She thought of the observatories built centuries ago, where astronomers would spend long nights charting the heavens. The Maragay Observatory, built in the 13th century, had been one of the most advanced of its time, with instruments designed to measure the movements of stars and planets. The Persians had not seen astronomy as separate from life. It was a way to understand harmony, to align the self with the order of creation. Soraya tilted her head back and let her gaze rest on the dome's patterns, then beyond to the true dome of the night sky. She traced constellations with her eyes, the Pleiades, Orion, faint outlines of the Great Bear. The stars shimmered endlessly, their patterns both fixed and ever-changing. They were the same stars that had shone over Persepolis when its grand columns still stood tall, the same stars that had guided caravans along the Silk Road, the same stars that now watched her in this garden. The thought filled her with a quiet awe. She felt herself dissolve into that continuum, another presence beneath the eternal watch of the cosmos. From nearby, the sound of water reached her ears again, steady and soothing. She followed it, stepping out of the pavilion and back into the garden. The path curved toward another pool, this one larger, its surface so still it seemed like glass. She sat at its edge and leaned forward, watching the stars mirrored perfectly. For a moment she could not tell which sky was above and which was below. The reflection was so clear that it seemed as though she could fall upward into the heavens or downward into their mirror. She thought of the Persian poets again. Rumi had once written that the soul is like water. It takes the shape of the vessel it inhabits, yet its essence is always fluid, always flowing, always reflecting. Looking at the pool now, Soraya understood those words more deeply. The water was a mirror not only for the stars, but for herself. In its stillness, it reflected her own stillness back to her. She reached down and dipped her hand into the pool, disturbing the reflection. Ripples spread outward, breaking the stars into shimmering fragments. And yet, within moments, the water stilled again, the stars reappearing as though nothing had happened. Soraya smiled softly. This too was a lesson. Stillness always returned. Harmony was not easily broken. It waited patiently beneath every ripple, ready to reveal itself again. She leaned back, resting her weight on her palms, and closed her eyes. The scent of night-blooming jasmine was stronger now, wrapping around her like a veil. The sound of the pool's gentle trickle joined the chorus of crickets, forming a lullaby that seemed written for her alone. In the distance, she thought she heard the faintest notes of a flute drifting on the breeze. Whether real or imagined, it mattered little. The music folded into the night, carrying her further into calm. She imagined a Sufi mystic sitting beneath a tree, playing softly, each note rising like a prayer into the stars. The ney flute was said to embody longing, the soul's yearning to return to its source. Hearing it now, even in memory, she felt that longing ease into peace. Her body grew heavier, her breath slower. She let her mind wander gently, not clinging to thoughts, only watching them drift like clouds across a night sky. She thought of the old Persian kings who had built gardens not only for pleasure, but as reflections of their vision of paradise. Shah Abbas had filled Isfahan with such spaces where fountains sparkled and pavilions rose like jewels amid avenues of trees. To walk here now was to step into that legacy, to taste a fragment of the paradise they had imagined. And yet, she realized, paradise was not something built only of stone and water. It was this: the slowing of breath, the dissolving of thought, the presence of stillness. The garden was simply the mirror that revealed it. She opened her eyes once more and gazed at the stars reflected in the pool. They shimmered steadily, patient and eternal. She felt herself mirrored in them, her own presence dissolving into something larger, quieter, infinite. Time slipped away. Minutes, perhaps hours, passed unnoticed. The night deepened, and still the garden held her, cradling her in its silence. At last, Soraya rose again and walked slowly back toward the pavilion. She felt no weariness, only a deeper calm, as though her body itself had become an extension of the garden's stillness. She sat once more beneath its dome, leaning against the cool stone, her gaze drifting upward. The stars kept their watch, the water kept its rhythm, the garden kept its silence, and Soraya, folded into all of it, drifted ever deeper into peace. Chapter 8. The First Hints of Dawn. The night had wrapped itself fully around the garden, yet Soraya felt no heaviness. Instead, she felt as though she were floating, not through air, but through silence. The pavilion walls glowed faintly in the lantern light, their patterns softened into shadow, while beyond, the water channels gleamed like ribbons of ink woven through the earth. The stars had grown brighter, as they always do when the night leans into its deepest hours. Soraya gazed upward again, her eyes tracing the constellations she had begun to recognize. Orion's belt gleamed faintly. The Pleiades shimmered in a cluster fragile as pearls. Cassiopeia curved into her familiar throne of stars. Each constellation seemed not only a pattern, but a story. Stories told and retold through centuries. stories Persian astronomers had woven into their charts, stories poets had carried into verse. She leaned her back against the cool stone and closed her eyes. The sounds of the garden folded around her, the whisper of water, the steady hum of crickets, the occasional flutter of wings as moths moved toward lanterns. All of it created a kind of stillness that was not empty but alive, layered, infinite. And then she noticed something subtle. The stars at the eastern edge of the sky seemed softer now, their brilliance faintly dulled. The horizon held the slightest hint of change, as though the night were loosening its grip. Soraya rose and stepped out from the pavilion. Her sandals touched the stone path with a hushed rhythm, her body swaying slightly as she walked. The air felt cooler now, fresher, touched by something unseen. She paused beneath a cypress tree, its tall form etched dark against the sky, and drew in a slow breath. The scent of the night lingered, jasmine, roses, damp earth. But there was something else now too, the faint crispness that precedes dawn. She thought of the Persian poets who had written of this sacred threshold between night and day. Hafez had called it the hour of lovers, when the soul's secrets stir. Rumi had spoken of it as the time when the heart hears the whispers of the unseen more clearly than at any other moment. To walk the garden at this hour was to step into a space between worlds, not fully night, not yet day, a liminal pause where silence carried the weight of eternity. The water channels reflected the stars still, but they also carried that faint shift of light. Soraya knelt by one, dipping her fingers again into the cool surface. It rippled, breaking the reflections, but as the ripples faded, the water seemed to hold a new clarity, a readiness to mirror the sky's coming change. She rose again and wandered toward the orchard. The figs and pomegranates gleamed in shadow, their forms softened by lantern glow. Soon she knew they would catch the first rays of dawn, their skins glowing with life. She paused by a pomegranate tree and rested her hand lightly against its trunk. For Persians, the pomegranate had always been more than fruit. It was the symbol of renewal, of cycles, of the eternal return of life. Perhaps that was why it felt so right to stand here now, at the edge of night and day, beneath its branches. Her thoughts drifted to another Persian tradition, the gatherings of Sohbat, where friends would remain awake through the night, speaking softly, reciting poetry, sipping tea, waiting for dawn together. The garden would host such gatherings, its air filled with conversation, with verses of Hafez or Saadi read aloud, with music played gently in the background. Such nights were not meant to be hurried. They were meant to be savored, stretched out like silk threads, leading into the first light of morning. She imagined such a gathering here centuries ago. Lanterns glowing, friends leaning together on carpets spread beneath the cypress trees, their laughter soft, their eyes bright with starlight. Cups of tea passing from hand to hand, bowls of pomegranate seeds shining like rubies in the dim light. Someone reciting poetry, their voice steady, carrying the words into the silence. At dawn, let us ask the breeze what secrets it carries from the beloved's lips. The thought lingered in Soraya's heart as she walked. The poets had always known what she now felt, that the hours before dawn were filled with a kind of tenderness, a softness that belonged not only to the world but to the soul. She followed the path until it opened to a larger pool, one she had not seen before. It spread wide and still, bordered by marble, its surface black as ink. She sat at its edge, drawing her knees close, and gazed at the sky reflected there. The stars shimmered as though caught in water's embrace. And there, yes, she could see it, the faintest silver line along the horizon, delicate, almost invisible, but present nonetheless. The night was shifting. She breathed in slowly, deeply, letting the realization settle into her body. The night had been long, but it was not endless, and yet in its length she had discovered something eternal, the patience of stars, the rhythm of water, the whispers of silence. She felt no sadness at its passing, only gratitude. She thought of how ancient Persians had celebrated the cycles of night and day, of seasons, of renewal. Festivals like Yalda honored the longest night, when families would gather with fruit and poetry, awaiting the dawn. They celebrated not to resist the night, but to embrace its gifts, knowing dawn would always follow. The garden itself was built upon that truth, that darkness and light, silence and song, stillness and movement were not opposites but companions, weaving harmony through time. Soraya leaned back on her hands, her gaze drifting again to the horizon. The line of silver had widened faintly, though stars still held their place above. She thought of how dawn was never sudden in these lands. It arrived like a gentle guest, knocking softly, allowing the night to finish its song. The air grew cooler still, brushing against her cheeks with a softness that felt like blessing. She wrapped her scarf closer and closed her eyes, letting the night's lullaby fold around her one last time. And in that space, not fully asleep, not fully awake, she felt herself dissolve once more. The garden was no longer outside her, but within her. Its water flowed through her veins. Its fragrance filled her breath. Its silence became her silence. Time slipped away again. Perhaps she dozed. Perhaps she dreamed. She could not tell. All she knew was that when she opened her eyes once more, the eastern horizon had shifted further. The silver line had grown into a faint glow, a whisper of gold brushing against the edge of the world. The garden stirred with it. A bird called softly from the branches of a fig tree. Another answered from deeper in the orchard. The cricket's chorus began to fade, replaced by this tentative birdsong. Even the roses seemed to hold themselves differently, their petals catching the first suggestion of light. Soraya smiled softly. Dawn was still far, but it was coming. And in its coming, the garden revealed yet another of its truths. Nothing remained fixed. Even silence moved. Even stillness breathed. Even night unfolded into day. She drew her knees closer to her chest and rested her chin upon them. Her eyes followed the horizon, watching the glow widen, watching the first soft strokes of color appear, faint blues, delicate rose, a breath of amber. It was like watching a painter at work, each stroke deliberate, each shade layered with care. And through it all, the stars kept shining. They did not vanish suddenly. They lingered, patient, unwilling to leave until dawn itself was undeniable. Soraya watched them with affection, grateful for their watchful company, grateful for their steady light through the long night. The garden, too, lingered with her. Its lanterns flickered faintly still, though their glow was weaker now against the horizon's growing light. The water channels carried both stars and dawn, mirrors of two worlds meeting at once. The air carried both night's coolness and the promise of day's warmth. Soraya breathed in deeply, her chest expanding with ease. She felt as though she had walked not only through a garden, but through time itself, through centuries of poetry and philosophy, through the cycles of night and day, through the endless rhythm of belonging. And in that moment, as the first hints of dawn gathered upon the horizon, she felt herself whole, at peace, and quietly eternal. Chapter 9. The Hour of Lovers. The night had not vanished, yet it had begun to loosen its hold. Soraya could sense it even before her eyes found proof in the sky. The stars, though still glittering, seemed less absolute, their brilliance gently dimmed by the faintest suggestion of dawn pressing at the horizon. She sat upon the marble platform by the pool, her knees tucked to her chest, her scarf drawn close around her shoulders. The water beneath her mirrored both worlds, the black velvet of night above, and the slow wash of pale light rising at the edges of the earth. It was a meeting of opposites, yet not in conflict, The garden showed her again what it had been teaching all along: harmony. The air itself had changed. It carried with it a subtle crispness, as though the garden had inhaled deeply and now exhaled freshness. Soraya drew in a long breath, filling her chest with that gift. She could still taste the night, the fragrance of jasmine, the damp perfume of roses at rest, the faint musk of cypress bark. Yet threaded through it now was the clean edge of morning, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. And then the silence broke. It was not the noise of day, not the bustle of voices or footsteps. It was a single call, high, clear, trembling. A bird somewhere in the orchard had awakened before the others, its song rising alone into the still, dark air. Soraya lifted her head, her heart stirring with it. The song paused, then began again, fuller this time, as though the bird had remembered its place in the eternal rhythm. Another call answered from deeper in the garden, then another, softer, from the branches above her. Soon the air began to shimmer with sound, each note fragile yet insistent, as though the birds themselves were calling the dawn into being. Persian poets had long celebrated this hour. They called it Sahar, the pre-dawn, the hour of lovers. It was believed that the veil between worlds was thinnest then, that prayers rose more easily, that longing was heard more clearly. Rumi had written of it often. At dawn, a secret comes to whisper in your ear. Don't go back to sleep. Soraya felt the truth of those words. The garden itself seemed to lean closer now, whispering through the song of birds, through the trickle of water, through the stir of leaves in the faintest breeze. She closed her eyes and let it all fold around her, her heart listening more deeply than her ears. The nightingales began their chorus, rich and layered, their voices weaving through the air with passion that seemed too great for their small bodies. The nightingale had always been the bird of Persian poetry, the eternal lover singing to the rose. Soraya imagined their unseen wings trembling as they called out, their song a declaration of longing, of devotion, of love without end. She thought of Hafez, who had written so many verses about nightingales and roses. For him, the garden was never only a place of beauty, it was a mirror for the heart. The nightingale's song was the soul's cry. The rose's bloom was the beloved's face. The cypress was the stature of the beloved. The water was longing's flow. Listening now, Soraya felt those metaphors come alive around her. The pool rippled faintly as a breeze moved across it, scattering the stars reflected there. Yet even as the reflections broke, the true stars above remained steady. She smiled softly. How many times had poets written of this? The world of appearances shifting like water while truth remained unchanged above. The bird song swelled, joined now by sparrows, doves, and the soft cooing of turtle doves perched among the orchard trees. The garden was no longer silent. Yet the sound was not harsh. It was gentle, layered, rising in waves that soothed as much as they stirred. Soraya leaned her head back against the marble and let her eyes drift closed. She imagined lovers, centuries ago, meeting in gardens like this at dawn, their voices hushed, their glances hidden, their hearts speaking what words could not. This was their hour, the time when longing was most alive, when the soul itself seemed to awaken before the body. Persian poetry was filled with such scenes, for love and dawn had always belonged together. She remembered a verse of Saadi: "At dawn lovers are awake, for the call of the beloved cannot be ignored." The words drifted through her as naturally as breath. She did not resist them. She simply allowed them to mingle with the birdsong, with the fragrance of jasmine, with the rhythm of water. Her body softened further, her breath slowing. She felt as though she were dissolving not into sleep, but into something deeper, a kind of waking dream, where the boundaries between herself and the garden blurred. She was the water, reflecting stars and dawn. She was the rose, releasing fragrance into the cool air. She was the nightingale, her heart spilling into song. The horizon brightened faintly, shifting from silver to the palest blue. The stars faded, though not all at once. They lingered, patient, unwilling to depart until the sun itself appeared. Soraya watched them with tenderness, grateful for their long vigil. She thought again of Yalda, the festival that marked the year's longest night. Families would gather with fruit and poetry, awaiting dawn together, celebrating the victory of light over darkness. Yet here, in this garden, she realized that darkness had never been defeated. It had been embraced, savored, honored, until light returned in its own time. The two were companions, not enemies. Her eyes followed the horizon as the faintest pink began to brush its edge. The birds sang louder now, their voices swelling with the color. She could almost believe they were painting the sky with their song. Each note seemed to lift a stroke of rose, a sweep of amber, a touch of gold. Soraya smiled faintly, her heart loosening with it. She thought of how the garden had carried her through afternoon, through evening, through night, and now into dawn. It was as though she had walked through time itself, each moment teaching her something new. The birds quieted suddenly, as if pausing in reverence, and in that pause the first ray of sunlight appeared, thin and golden, breaking across the horizon. It touched the tops of the cypress trees first, gilding them with light, then slid slowly downward, brushing the roses, catching the fountains, shimmering across the pool. Soraya drew in a long breath, her chest expanding with the light. The warmth of it touched her skin, gentle at first, then stronger. She felt as though the garden itself had awakened with her. The birds resumed their song, louder now, triumphant. The roses unfolded their petals more fully. The pomegranates gleamed like rubies in the growing light. The water channels carried golden reflections, ribbons of light weaving through the garden's symmetry. And Soraya, sitting quietly at the pool's edge, felt herself awaken too, not into urgency, not into haste, but into presence, into the simple joy of being here, in this moment, in this garden, beneath this dawn. She closed her eyes again, letting the warmth rest upon her face, her breath steady, her body soft. She had no need for thought now. The garden was enough. The dawn was enough. The silence, the song, the light, all of it was enough. And so she sat, still and quiet, as the first full glow of morning spread across the gardens of Persia, carrying her deeper, not into day, but into peace.